Ladies and gentlemen, first I would like to thank the people who read, completed and improved my text. Anton Bosselaars, Jack McMartin, Ulf Bramstra and Dick van der Meulen. Before I venture an answer to the question, what influence has the Dutch novel Max Havelaar had on the developments in the former Dutch colony of the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, I will tell you something about the novel and its author. Eduard Douwes Dekker was born in Amsterdam on March 2nd, 1820, and died in Nieder-Ingelheim on February 19th, 1887, just under 67 years old. At the age of 18, he went to the then Dutch colony of the Dutch East Indies, where he made a career as a civil servant in the service of the Dutch administration. On April 10th, 1846, he married Everdina Huberta van Wijnbergen, a baroness without money, better known as Tine. When he was 32 years old, he became ill and was granted permission to spend 2 years in the Netherlands on a so-called convalescent leave. On January 1st, 1854, Tine gave birth to their son Edu in Amsterdam. The leave was extended a few times and would eventually last almost 3 years. On May 20th, 1855, father, mother and son returned to the Dutch East Indies, where they arrived in autumn. Dekker was appointed assistant resident of the Regency of Lebak in the western part of the island of Java on January 4th, 1865. Lebak was one of the 5 regencies of the residence of Bantam, now Banten. A residence was governed by a resident, a Dutch official who reported to the Governor-General. In Bantam, the resident was Brest van Kempen. The Dutch left the existing power structure intact, but integrated it into their colonial administration. The Regency of Lebak was governed by Karta Nata Negara, a noble prince who was worshipped as a deity. Such a local ruler over a regency was called a regent. So the Dutch actually took the ruling regents into government service and paid them a salary. It was, however, much lower than what they were used to being able to spend. The regent of Lebak earned 700 guilders a month. By comparison, the assistant resident Dekker earned 500 guilders a month. But the regent had debts. Therefore, 150 guilders were deducted from his salary each month, so that only 550 guilders remained. With this money, he had to maintain his status, but also support 100 family members, which was, of course, impossible. Moreover, crops didn't grow well on the barren soil of Lebak. Compared to other regions, Karta Nata Negara was poor. With the introduction of salaried employment for local heads, the seed had been sown for abuse, theft, and extortion. Alongside the regent, there was also an assistant resident who was expected to work with the regent as an elder brother. In the Regency of Lebak, the new assistant resident was Eduard Douwes Dekker, as mentioned, from January 4th, 1856 on. In the text that an assistant resident had to pronounce when he took the oath, it was stated, among other things, that he had to see to the just treatment of the population. This oath would have far-reaching consequences for Dekker. It was common knowledge that poverty and abuse of power prevailed in Lebak. Immediately after his arrival in Lebak, Dekker noticed that his predecessor had already collected a lot of testimonies against the regent. Soon, the wronged inhabitants also came to complain to Dekker. The regent of Lebak had the population work for him at will. He also had buffaloes stolen from the inhabitants. For this reason, Dekker decided to sue him, along with one of his sons-in-law whom he considered to be an accomplice. However, Dekker had no hard evidence, and therefore he proposed to his superior, the resident, to lock up the local ruler and his son-in-law so that the inhabitants could testify without fear of reprisals. Dekker counted on the highest authority in the colony, Governor-General Duimar van Twist, to agree with him, because Van Twist had, in his own words, specially appointed Dekker to Lebak because there was still much to be done there, and because he knew that Dekker had a big heart for the natives. But neither the resident nor the Governor-General followed Dekker in his accusation. On the contrary, he was reprimanded for having acted too hastily and without consultation. He felt so insulted that he asked for honorable discharge, which was granted to him on April 4th, 1856. This left him without an income, and also voided his right to a pension, to which he would have been entitled after 20 years of service. Moreover, especially during his years in Holland, he had incurred many debts which he was now unable to repay. In mid-1857, he returned to Europe to plead his case after all. In vain. He settled in Brussels with no income and no money. His wife and son followed in the spring of 1859 in the company of Nonnie, the little daughter born in the Dutch East Indies during his absence on June 1st, 1857. Now, at his wits' end, Dekker decided to write down what he had experienced. He did so in Brussels in September-October 1859, in less than 1 month. The book was entitled Max Havelaar, or The Coffee Auctions of the Dutch Trading Company. Max Havelaar is the name of the main character and the alter ego of Dekker. As a writer's name, he chose Multatuli, Latin for I have borne much. Under that name, he is still known today as the most important Dutch writer of the 19th century. The book was published in May 1860 and hit like a bombshell. It was not the first, but it was the most ardent plea for better treatment of the inhabitants of the colony, and it was also immediately recognized as a literary masterpiece. It has since been translated into at least 40 languages, including Chinese and Japanese. Multatuli did not condemn colonization per se. He denounced, as mentioned, the local chiefs for abusing their power. But the Dutch authority figures were also guilty because they turned a blind eye to that abuse. So it was a double indictment against the criminal local heads and against a complicit colonizer. After his resignation, Multatuli also denounced the way he had been treated, discharged for simply having done his duty. After him, he reasoned, no public servant would dare to denounce abuse, since poverty was the result. He was thus a whistleblower who, as is still often the case today, was punished by his superiors rather than heard. Multatuli did not advocate an independent Indonesia, nor was he revolutionary in striving for better treatment of the population. Others had preceded him in that, such as Jacob Hafner and Franz Wilhelm Junghun. What was revolutionary was the fire and indignation with which he formulated his indictment. Multatuli was a 40-year-old débutant. The then famous writer and lawyer Jacob van Lennep, who, like Multatuli, was a Freemason, thought it was a masterful book and expressed his willingness to make its publication possible. He deleted a few overly critical passages and turned the indictment into a novel even more than it was by dividing it into chapters and by replacing dates and names with initials and dots. He also made it an expensive edition and only had 1,300 copies printed, of which only a few were shipped to the Dutch East Indies. Slowly, Multatuli, who had dreamt of a cheap popular edition to wake up the Dutch people, began to see that he had been cheated. He filed a lawsuit against van Lennep, but van Lennep had acquired a copyright to the book. He was also a lawyer, and he won the case. As a result, Max Havelaar was reprinted unaltered only once in 1860, and then again only 11 years later, although an illegal so-called double printing is also known to exist. It was not until 1875 that Multatuli was able to publish his book for the first time, as he had wanted 15 years earlier. The fifth edition followed in 1881, the last to appear during his lifetime. The book has been criticized in at least two ways. First, regarding the facts. For example, Multatuli speaks of a ravine behind his house, when all that ran there was a river with an admittedly steep bank. He writes that he made nightly explorations on horseback, which is rather unlikely given the distances alone. He writes that the residents sought him out at night to complain about the regent and his henchmen, but they spoke Sundanese, and Dekker spoke only Malay. Based on such inaccuracies, the book was rejected by some as romantic fantasy, and thus worthless as a reliable indictment. Multatuli's response was that he readily admitted to having fantasized here and there, but that this did not detract from the main issue, which was that the Javanese were mistreated. A second critique was that Multatuli did not sufficiently understand local traditions and customs and wanted to apply European enlightened principles to a society that functioned completely differently. The Dutch East Indies were not governed by European law, but by Islamic customary law, the so-called adat. This allowed local chiefs to treat their subjects as serfs. The population itself wanted this out of respect for the heads. Multatuli did know the adat, but he considered the enlightened European legal system superior to the feudal traditions that prevailed in the colony, and thought it was the colonizers' task to introduce that system. Let us now turn to the question of what influence Max Havelaar had on developments in Indonesia. We will do that in three ways. First, how was Max Havelaar's message interpreted? Second, among which population groups was the book known and did it have an influence on their actions? Third, how can the various interpretations be chronologically linked to the development of the colony into a sovereign state? First, then, the question of how people saw and perceived Multatuli in Indonesia. I distinguish four views. The first is that the main character, Max Havelaar, and therefore Multatuli, is profoundly humane. There is a great consensus on this. Another group feels, as outlined above, that Multatuli had too little understanding of the age-old traditions, the adat, and the difficult position of the regent. A third group sees Multatuli not only as a protector of the Javanese, but also as a pioneer of the independence of Indonesia. That vision is legitimized by the ending of Max Havelaar, in which Multatuli exclaims, "Delivery and help, lawfully if possible, lawfully with violence if need be." Fourth, the regent is portrayed as a villain. In the eyes of his descendants who still hold high positions today, Max Havelaar has forever unfairly slandered and tarnished their ancestor and family. What makes it worse is that in his novel he lists the Dutch authority figures under a pseudonym, but calls the native ones by their real names. Our second question was, which stratum or group of the Indonesian population was familiar with the book Max Havelaar? Education in Indonesia was poor until before World War II. In 1930, only 10% of men and 2.2% of women could read and write. There was no reading culture at all, and furthermore, no translation of Max Havelaar was available in any of the languages spoken in Indonesia until 1972. The colonial administration had every interest in keeping it that way, because being able to read leads to insight and empowerment, and they preferred submissive workers to troublesome rebels. Partly due to the influence of Max Havelaar, a start was made from 1900 on the so-called ethical policy. In 1901, Queen Wilhelmina declared in her speech from the throne that the Netherlands, as a Christian power, also had a moral calling to fulfill. During the next 20 years, efforts were made to provide more economic opportunities, more modern healthcare, more intensive missionary work, and better infrastructure. Education in particular received attention, but was limited to the elites. From Max Havelaar, two excerpts became popular. The first is the 17th chapter. It is the story of a boy, Saidia, and his sweetheart, Adinda. A buffalo is taken from Saidia's father 3 times by the local chiefs. He flees Lebak because he can no longer pay his land rent, is arrested, and dies in prison. Saidia's mother dies of grief. 15-year-old Saidia goes to Batavia, now Jakarta, to earn money and promises Adinda that he will return after 3 years to marry her. When he returns after 3 years, he finds that Adinda and the villagers have been mistreated and murdered by the Dutch army. Desperate, he throws himself upon the bayonet of a Dutch rifle. At least 9 translations of this story were made between 1921 and 1960. The second fragment is the so-called Speech to the Heads of Lebak. It is the fictional speech that Max Havelaar gives when he accepts his position as assistant resident, and which, in addition to subtle criticism of the existing abuses, also expresses a great concern. The future fighters for independence were introduced to those texts at school and, as time went on, would see Multatuli not only as a protector of the Javanese, but also as their liberator. One of them was the future first president of Free Indonesia, Sukarno. In his speeches, he invariably quoted from Max Havelaar. He even named a warship Multatuli. The Indonesian writer Yassin stated in 1973 that works by Multatuli could be found in the bookshelves of all the country's leading figures before World War II. It is fitting also to mention here Kartini, daughter of a progressive regent, who had the opportunity to attend the European elementary school. Girls were not allowed to study further. She knew the work by Multatuli. Under his influence, she became the first Indonesian advocate for women's rights and for the right to education for girls. She herself founded several girls' schools. In 1904, she died at the age of 25. Multatuli thus contributed not only to the liberation of Indonesia, but also to raising awareness and emancipation in a broader sense. Now, third, let us look at the influence of Max Havelaar more chronologically. Until 1900, the book had no direct influence among the Indonesian population. In the Netherlands, on the other hand, the book had an immediate effect. On September 25, 1860, it came up, without the title being mentioned, in the lower house during the deliberations on the reply to the speech from the throne. William III had, after all, according to time-honored custom, called the situation in the colonies satisfactory. Liberal member of the lower house Van Heuvel took the floor on that occasion and spoke. A certain shiver has lately gone through the country, caused by a book. I may point out the fact that because of that book, great anxiety, yes, I dare say indignation, has arisen in many minds in this country. And in that situation, the good citizenry now learns from the throne speech the situation is satisfactory in all respects. Will that word from the throne speech be able to take away the impression of that book? Still in 1860, Van Heuvel wrote that Multatuli had formulated his indictment with a glow, a fire, a heart stroke, an indignation that seems at last to wake up the Netherlands. A month after Multatuli died in 1887, the Java Bode wrote about Max Havelaar. The influence this book had and still has on Indian politics is simply incalculable. Before that time, there were only very few people in the Netherlands who knew something about the Indies. The generation of civil servants who built a future in the Dutch East Indies after Max Havelaar knew the book. From 1900 onward, the Netherlands pursued, as mentioned, an ethical colonial policy. the Dutch East Indies had to be slowly prepared to become an independent democratic nation according to the Western model. Schools were founded where the Indonesian elites were educated and became more and more involved in governance. A high point in this development was the installation of a People's Council in 1918, a kind of parliament that for the time being only had advisory powers, but in time had to develop into a fully fledged democratic parliament. A consequence of the ethical policy was the growth of a Western-oriented nationalist movement. In 1912, the Indian Party was founded, which had only a small following and was banned in 1913. Much more successful was the Islamic Society, which was also founded in 1912. The third party was the Communist Party, which was founded in 1914. In this period, Multatuli was seen by many young Indonesians and in nationalist speeches and writings, not only as an advocate for more humane treatment of the Indonesian population, but increasingly as a supporter in the struggle for independence. The popular story of Saidia and Adinda was read as an anti-colonial manifesto in the resistance against Dutch rule. This is mainly due to the following sentence that has become famous. One day, Saidia wandered through a village that had just been taken by the Dutch army and was, therefore, in flames. It is worth mentioning that Ernest Douwesdekker, an Indo-European grandson of Jan, an older brother of Multatuli, founded the first political party in the colony already mentioned in 1912, with two supporters under the name Indische Partij. That party stood up for both Indonesians and Indo-Europeans and was already striving for an Indies for the Indians and an Indies separate from the Netherlands. In 1913, the frontmen were exiled to the Netherlands and the party died a quiet death. Ernest thus shared his great-uncle's concerns, but in a much more radical way. He was imprisoned more than once. His novel, The Book of Siman de Javan, is a powerful call for rebellion and independence, but does not reach the literary level of his great-uncle. In 1947, Ernest Douwesdekker was part of the Provisional Parliament, but was arrested again. Just under a year before his death, he was able to witness the transfer of sovereignty on December 27, 1949. In 1961, he was recognized as a hero of Indonesia, an honorary title posthumously awarded by the President. On August 17, 1945, Sukarno proclaimed the independence of Indonesia, but it took another 4 years before, after much bloodshed and diplomatic consultations, the official transfer of sovereignty could take place. A tragic fact is the following. In March 1878, Multatuli, who still had very little contact with his 2 children, and his second wife, Mimi Humming Schepel, adopted a 2-year-old boy. He had been born on January 25, 1876, and was named Eduard Bernhold, but Multatuli and his wife called him Wouter. He survived the Japanese occupation of Indonesia, but in 1945 he was mistreated by Republican Indonesians to the point of death. In the years that followed, Indonesia got to know Multatuli not only because Sukarno invariably quoted from Max Havelaar in speeches that could be listened to on the radio, but also because the story of Saidia and Adinda reached an ever-widening audience as a book, a serial, and a radio play. In 1956, an impetus for a film adaptation was published, but it was never realized. In the 1950s and 1960s, the communist following grew steadily. The economy was in decline, and there was famine. Multatuli now surfaced in the leftist media, no longer as an anti-colonialist, but as an anti-imperialist and proletarian humanist. After all, his struggle against oppression, abuse of power, and social injustice fit perfectly with communist ideology. That changed completely when Suharto installed a military dictatorship in 1967. On February 28, 1968, an article appeared in the daily Compass in which the author wrote, "Saidias are still here, even though we are now a century away. Even though the situation has changed and although we are now independent." Asked why that was, he replied, "Because our mentality is still generally the same as in the middle of the 19th century, the same submissiveness to the heads, the same ignorance, the same illiteracy." The population in Suharto's new order had better not read anything like that. And so interest in Max Havelaar and Multatuli was put on the back burner. Nevertheless, in 1972, the first published translation of Max Havelaar into Bahasa Indonesia by Yassin was published with the help of Dutch subsidy. It became a bestseller in a country with a virtually non-existent reading culture. In 1976, the film adaptation of Max Havelaar by Fons Rademakers was ready, but was immediately banned. A film is a much more accessible and therefore dangerous medium than a book. The chance that viewers would compare the colonial Dutch East Indies of 1860 with Suharto's dictatorship was too great a risk. 1987 marked the 100-year anniversary of Multatuli's death, and Indonesia could hardly let that go unnoticed. That's when the film was released, albeit somewhat abbreviated. This led not only to greater awareness of Multatuli and his work, but also to discussions and publications in which the views we now know resurfaced. When the dictatorship ended, space became available again to criticize the little progress that had been made since Max Havelaar. The book was now interpreted as a stimulus to do better than 140 years ago. Anno 2021, Multatuli appears to be more present than ever in Indonesia. In the main town of the Regency of Lebak, Rangkas Bitung, where Max Havelaar delivered his famous speech to the heads of Lebak, the Multatuli Museum opened on February 11th, 2018. A portrait in plexiglass can be seen in the hall with the text, "The vocation of man is to be man," above it, in Bahasa Indonesia. Next door, a library has been built, christened Saidia Adinda. This is how Multatuli will get the Javanese to read after all. The museum reflects much of what we discover together in two ways. First, because Multatuli is shown here as a man, a writer, a whistleblower, and a pioneer of independence. Moreover, it introduces us to Indonesian writers and novelists who are inspired by Multatuli because his book also influenced Indonesia's literary world. He even influenced the proponent of the Philippine independence struggle, Jose Rizal. In 1999, Indonesian writer Pramudia Anantatur published an article on Max Havelaar in the New York Times titled "The Book That Killed Colonialism." While the West yearned for spice, Multatuli cried for justice. The second way in which the museum reflects what we have discussed is that it did not come about without a struggle. Even 160 years after Max Havelaar, the resistance was great. That Multatuli accused the regent of extortion has not yet been forgotten. On November 10th, 2017, several dozen students who still have a link to the old regent demonstrated in front of the office of the current regent. Others found it inappropriate to extol Multatuli so much under the motto, "An occupier remains an occupier." There is already an important street named after Multatuli, as well as the auditorium of the district secretariat, an elementary school, and a pharmacy. Some people thought that was more than enough. A group of students even demanded the resignation of the regent who supported the museum initiative, because fighting the poverty of the people is more important than a museum for Multatuli. In any case, all this makes it clear that Multatuli is still alive in Indonesia, and that his Max Havelaar is so richly varied that the book still both aggravates and inspires. Thank you for your attention.